When we think of Japan, we often picture the refined court of Kyoto, the martial valor of the samurai, or the fiery devastation of Hiroshima. Yet before all of that, before emperors, shoguns, and world wars, these islands were home to small bands of people who lived by the sea, the forests, and the mountains. Their story begins far back in time, around 14,000 BCE, at the close of the last ice age. This age is what archaeologists call the Jōmon period. The name Jōmon means cord-marked, taken from the patterns pressed into clay vessels by ropes. These people were among the earliest in the world to create pottery. Some fragments found in caves and ancient pit dwellings date back more than 12,000 years, making them some of the oldest surviving ceramics on Earth. At a time when much of humanity still relied on stone tools and skins, the Jōmon were fashioning clay pots for storage, cooking, and ritual. The Jōmon people lived as hunter-gatherers and fishers. They foraged acorns, chestnuts, and wild plants. They hunted deer and boar in the forests. Along the coasts, they gathered shellfish, and the relationship with Korea was particularly significant. The Korean peninsula in this period was divided among three kingdoms: Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast, alongside the smaller Confederation of Gaia. Japan's ties to these kingdoms were complex, part alliance, part rivalry. The Yamato maintained close relations with Baekje, exchanging envoys, scholars, and military aid. It was through Baekje that many cultural influences flowed into Japan: advanced iron working, writing systems, and eventually Buddhism. Archaeological finds support this picture of contact. Korean-style horse trappings, armor, and weaponry appear in Kofun tombs. The spread of horses into Japan, beginning in the 4th century, revolutionized warfare, allowing Yamato elites to dominate their rivals with mounted combat. Bronze mirrors from China, inscribed with symbols of power, were also buried with Yamato rulers, linking their authority to the prestige of the continent. Domestically, the Kofun period saw increasing social stratification. Burial practices reveal sharp distinctions. Some tombs contained lavish goods, swords, armor, jewelry, bronze bells, while others were far humbler. This growing inequality reflected a society organized into ranks of nobles, warriors, and commoners. At the top stood the Yamato rulers, surrounded by powerful clans known as Uji. Each clan traced its ancestry to a mythical or divine being, and each controlled its own lands and followers. The Yamato leader, or Okimi, Great King, sought to stand above them all. Among the key clans were the Mononobe, guardians of military matters, and weaponry, the Nakatomi, who performed sacred rituals, and the Soga, who would later champion the spread of Buddhism. These clans formed the political backbone of the Yamato state, their cooperation essential to the king's rule. The Yamato rulers also invested in monumental display. The Kofun tombs themselves, some surrounded by thousands of clay figurines called hanawa, were statements of authority. These hollow terracotta figures, shaped as warriors, animals, houses, or even dancers, were placed around the tombs. Their purpose is debated, perhaps to protect the dead, to symbolize the retinue that accompanied the ruler into the afterlife. Whatever their meaning, they testified to the resources and artistry marshaled by the Yamato elite. By the late 5th century CE, Yamato's reach extended deep into Honshu and parts of Shikoku and Kyushu. Yet its unity was never absolute. Power waxed and waned, contested by rival clans and shaped by foreign entanglements. Still, the outlines of a Japanese state were emerging, ruler claiming divine descent, supported by great clans, legitimized by foreign recognition, and sustained by control of land and people. It was also in this period that the idea of an imperial line began to crystallize. Later chronicles, such as the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, compiled in the 8th century CE, traced the descent of emperors back to Amaterasu herself. through figures such as Emperor Jimmu, said to have reigned in 660 BCE. These accounts blend myth and history, but their purpose was clear: to assert the continuity and divine origin of the Yamato dynasty. Though modern historians treat early emperors like Jimmu as legendary, the assertion of an unbroken line gave the Yamato rulers a powerful ideological tool. By the early 6th century CE, however, winds of change were blowing across East Asia. In 538 CE, according to tradition, an embassy from Baekje arrived in Japan, bearing an image of the Buddha and sacred texts. With this gift came a new faith, Buddhism, that would transform Japanese society. The introduction of Buddhism marks the conventional end of the Kofun period and the beginning of the Asuka era. Yet before Buddhism reshaped the archipelago, the Yamato state had already laid the foundations of centralized rule. It had bound together diverse clans under a single authority, erected monuments rivaling those of ancient civilizations, and positioned itself within the diplomatic networks of East Asia. From the rice paddies of the Yayoi to the colossal tombs of the Kofun, Japan had become a society of kings and clans, of ritual and warfare, of ambition reaching beyond its shores. The story of Yamato is the story of Japan's first steps toward statehood. It was a fragile and shifting power, reliant on the cooperation of great families and the recognition of neighbors. But it established patterns that would endure: the claim of divine descent, the role of powerful clans, the balance of ritual and politics, and the interplay with continental powers. In the centuries to come, these patterns would be tested, reformed, and renewed as Japan entered the age of writing, Buddhism, and imperial courts. By the middle of the 6th century CE, Japan was on the brink of transformation. The centuries of the Kofun period had given the Yamato clan supremacy, binding together a patchwork of powerful families. Monumental tombs still dotted the landscape, reminders of rulers who claimed divine ancestry and political command. Yet new winds were blowing from the continent, winds carrying ideas, technologies, and beliefs that would remake the Japanese archipelago. This new age is called the Asuka period, named after the region south of Nara where the Yamato court settled. It lasted from 538 CE to 710 CE, and in these years, Japan entered the written record of history, embraced a new faith, and began building the structures of a centralized state. The pivotal moment came in 538 CE. According to the Nihon Shoki, the chronicle completed in 720 CE, an embassy arrived from the Korean kingdom of Baekje. Its envoys presented the Yamato court with sacred texts, ritual objects, and an image of the Buddha. They urged the Japanese rulers to adopt this new faith that was sweeping across East Asia. Another tradition, preserved in the Jogu Shitoku, Taizetsu, places the event later, in 552 CE, but the earlier date of 538 is widely accepted by historians. The gift ignited fierce debate among Japan's great clans. Some saw in Buddhism a foreign creed that threatened the native kami and the rituals of Shinto. Others saw its potential as a source of legitimacy, learning, and prestige, linking Japan more closely to the great civilizations of China and Korea. The opposition was led by the Mononobe clan, guardians of ancient rites and military strength, and the Nakatomi clan, who conducted the sacred ceremonies of the sun goddess Amaterasu. To them, worship of a foreign deity risked angering the gods and disrupting the order of the land. The champions of Buddhism were the Soga clan, rising in power through their control of finance and land. The Soga argued that Japan could not remain isolated if it hoped to keep pace with its continental neighbors. Embracing Buddhism, they insisted, would not replace the kami but could coexist alongside them, enriching the spiritual life of the people. This clash of visions erupted into open conflict. In 587 CE, after years of political maneuvering, the Soga and Mononobe faced one another in battle at Shijusen. The Mononobe leader, Mononobe no Moriya, was defeated and killed, and the power of his clan broken. The victory secured the place of Buddhism in Japan and propelled the Soga to dominance within the Yamato court. With this victory, the Soga clan became kingmakers. They married into the imperial line, placing their daughters as consorts and influencing the succession of emperors. It was during this time that one of the most remarkable figures in Japan's early history emerged, Prince Shotoku. Born in 574 CE, Shotoku was the son of Emperor Yomiya and a Soga mother. When Emperor Suko, his aunt, ascended the throne in 593 CE, the first woman in Japan to rule as empress, Otoku was appointed regent and chancellor. For the next 2 decades, he would shape the course of Japan's statecraft and religion. Shotoku was a devout Buddhist, a scholar, and a statesman. He commissioned temples, including Shitenoji in Osaka and the Great Horiji near Nara, which survives as one of the world's oldest wooden buildings. These temples were not only centers of worship, but also symbols of the new order, places where continental architecture, art, and learning took root in Japan. But Shotoku's reforms went beyond religion. In 604 CE, he issued the famous 17-article constitution, a set of moral and political principles. It was not a constitution in the modern sense, but a guide for officials and rulers, infused with Confucian and Buddhist ideals. It urged harmony, respect for hierarchy, and obedience to the sovereign. Harmony is to be valued. It began, reflecting Confucian emphasis on order and stability. The articles demanded integrity from officials, condemned corruption, and elevated the emperor as the ultimate authority. Shotoku also sought recognition abroad. In 607 CE, he dispatched an embassy to the Sui dynasty of China. The letter addressed to Emperor Yang of Sui began with words that startled the Chinese court. From the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises to the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets. To the Chinese, who saw themselves as the center of the world, this assertion of equality was almost offensive. Yet it revealed Japan's growing confidence and its awareness of its place within a broader Asian sphere. These missions brought back more than titles and exchanges. They carried with them Chinese writing, Confucian ethics, Buddhist texts, calendrical systems, and administrative models. For the first time, Japan was absorbing not just isolated influences, but a coherent civilizational package. The Asuka period also witnessed profound changes in art and culture. Sculpture and painting, inspired by the styles of China's Northern Wei and Tang dynasties, and Korea's beach artisans, flourished in Buddhist temples. Bronze images of the Buddha, serene and meditative, were cast with exquisite skill. Pagodas rose into the sky, their layered roofs evoking the cosmic order. Murals and sutra copying spread the teachings of the new religion. Yet the process of centralization was not smooth. After Shotoku died in 622 CE, the Soga clan continued to dominate, but their power bred resentment. By the mid-7th century, opposition crystallized around a young prince named Naka no Oi. In 645 CE, Naka no Oi, with the support of Nakatomi no Kamatari, launched a coup. The head of the Soga clan, Soga no Irika, was assassinated during a court ceremony, and the clan's grip on power was shattered. This event is remembered as the Ishii Incident. Out of this upheaval came a sweeping series of reforms known as the Taika Reform, Great Change. The Taika Reform, proclaimed in 646 CE, sought to remake Japan's political structure along Chinese lines. Lands were declared the property of the state, to be redistributed to peasants who paid taxes and provided labor. A census system was introduced to regulate population and resources. Provinces and districts were reorganized, and officials appointed by the central court rather than by hereditary clans. The reforms aimed to weaken the power of the great families and strengthen the authority of the emperor. This vision was ambitious, and its implementation was uneven. In practice, powerful clans retained much influence, and resistance simmered. Yet the reforms marked a turning point, the first deliberate effort to craft a centralized, bureaucratic state in Japan. In the decades that followed, Japan's rulers continued to look to China for models. Embassies were dispatched to the Tang dynasty, then at its height of cultural and political glory. Envoys returned with knowledge of law codes, urban planning, music, and literature. The Tang capital of Chang'an became a template for the cities that Japan would later build. Religion continued to intertwine with politics. In 672 CE, a succession dispute erupted after the death of Emperor Tenji. The resulting conflict, known as the Jinshin War, pitted his son, Prince Otomo, against his brother, Prince Ōama. After fierce battles, Ōama triumphed and ascended the throne as Emperor Tenmu. His reign, from 673 to 686 CE, reinforced this centralizing trend. Tenmu ordered the compilation of genealogies to solidify the imperial line, patronized Buddhism, and worked to diminish the power of the clans. His successor, Empress Jidai, r. 686 to 697 CE, continued his policies. It was under her rule that the decision was made to build a new permanent capital at Fujiwara, laid out in 694 CE on a Chinese-style grid pattern. This marked Japan's first planned capital, a precursor to the greater cities yet to come. The Asuka period thus culminated in a transformation of Japanese society. By 710 CE, when the court moved to a new capital at Nara called Heijō-kyo, a new era began, known as the Nara period. Japan had shifted from a confederation of clans led by Yamato kings to an embryonic state led by emperors, supported by a centralized bureaucracy, guided by Buddhist and Confucian ideals, and integrated into the wider East Asian world. The legacy of the Asuka age is immense. It was in these years that Buddhism took root, blending with Shinto to create a uniquely Japanese religious landscape. It was in this age that the emperor emerged not only as a divine descendant, but as a ruler in the Chinese mold, supported by law and bureaucracy. It was in this age that Japan looked beyond its shores, asserting itself as a civilization in dialogue and sometimes rivalry with China and Korea. The Asuka period was, in many ways, Japan's first Renaissance. Its rulers adopted, adapted, and transformed ideas from abroad, laying the foundations of the classical civilization that would flourish in the centuries to come. In the year 710 CE, a profound transformation occurred in Japan's political and cultural landscape. For centuries, the Yamato rulers had shifted their courts from one place to another, following the traditions of a peripatetic kingship. Capitals were temporary, often relocated after the death of a sovereign to avoid ritual pollution. But now, inspired by the great capitals of China's Tang dynasty, Japan's rulers established a permanent center of power, Heijō-kyo, known today as Nara. This new city marked the beginning of the Nara period, lasting from 710 to 794 CE. It was Japan's first true capital, a monumental step towards centralized government and an enduring state. Laid out on a rectangular grid, with broad avenues, palace precincts, and orderly districts. Haijō-kyo was modeled on Chang'an, the Tang capital. At its heart stood the Imperial Palace, where the emperor presided over court ceremonies and governance. Surrounding it were administrative offices, noble residences, markets, and temples. For the first time, Japan envisioned itself not just as a confederation of clans, but as a nation with a permanent seat of power. The establishment of Nara was part of a broader process of codification and reform. In 701 CE, just before the move, the court had promulgated the Taisho Code, a comprehensive set of administrative and penal laws modeled on the Tang legal system. Together with the earlier Asuka Kayamahara Code of 689 CE, the Taisho Code formalized the Ritsuryo system, a centralized bureaucracy grounded in Confucian and legalist principles. Under the Ritsuryo system, land was declared property of the state and allocated to cultivators in return for taxes and labor service. The population was registered in household registers and organized into administrative units of provinces, kuni, districts, gun, and townships, ri. Officials were appointed by the central court, and a hierarchy of ministries and bureaus oversaw matters ranging from finance to ritual. This was Japan's first experiment in creating a Confucian-style bureaucratic state. At the pinnacle stood the emperor, styled as a sovereign with both political and ritual authority. Yet behind the throne, powerful aristocratic clans and influential Buddhist institutions often steered policy. The Nara period was an age of tension between the ideals of centralization and the realities of aristocratic power. One of the defining features of this age was the embrace of Buddhism as a pillar of the state. The faith that had arrived a century and a half earlier was now fully integrated into the structures of governance. Emperors saw in Buddhism a source of legitimacy and protection for the realm. Temples were endowed with land, monks with privilege, and Buddhist rituals with state sponsorship. The most striking example of this is the reign of Emperor Shomu, r. 724 to 749 CE. Deeply devout, Shomu envisioned Buddhism as the glue binding the nation. In 741 CE, in the aftermath of devastating smallpox epidemics that had ravaged the population, he issued an edict calling for the construction of a network of provincial temples, kokubunji, and nunneries, kokubunaji, throughout the country. These temples were to act not only as centers of worship, but as instruments of state power, radiating the authority of the central court into the provinces. At the center of this network stood a colossal project, the Todaiji Temple in Nara, built as the head temple of all provincial establishments. Within its great hall was enshrined the great Buddha, Daibutsu, a towering bronze statue of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha. Casting began in 743 CE, and the statue, over 15 meters high, was completed in 752 CE, consecrated in a grand ceremony attended by monks from across Asia. The great Buddha was a statement of ambition, a symbol of the state's alignment with Buddhist cosmology, and a claim that Japan stood among the great Buddhist civilizations of the world. Yet the close ties between Buddhism and state power also bred corruption and conflict. Temples accumulated land and wealth, while monks became politically entangled. Some, like the monk Dokyo in the late 8th century, rose to extraordinary influence, challenging the balance between religious and secular authority. The court also sponsored monumental literary and historical works. In 712 CE, the Kojiki, Records of Ancient Matters, was completed, the oldest surviving chronicle of Japan. It combined myth, genealogy, and history to trace the imperial line back to the sun goddess Amaterasu and the divine creation of the islands. 8 years later, in 720 CE, the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, was compiled. Written in classical Chinese, the scholarly language of East Asia, it offered a more detailed and formal history, presenting Japan as a civilized state on par with China and Korea. These works were not neutral histories. They were instruments of ideology, crafted to legitimize the rule of the Yamato dynasty as eternal and divinely ordained. By anchoring the emperors in both myth and historical record, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki gave the imperial house an aura of antiquity and continuity that would endure for centuries. Another great project was the Minyō collection of 10,000 leaves, an anthology of poetry compiled in the latter half of the 8th century. Unlike the court-centered Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, the Minyō captured voices from a broader spectrum of society: emperors, nobles, soldiers, and commoners. Written in a mix of Chinese characters and phonetic readings, its poems celebrated love, nature, loyalty, and grief. It stands as one of the earliest masterpieces of Japanese literature, offering a window into the emotions and sensibilities of the age. The Nara period was also marked by challenges. The implementation of the Ritsuryo system strained under realities on the ground. Land redistribution was difficult to enforce, and as decades passed, powerful aristocrats and temples accumulated private estates, known as shōgun. These estates were exempt from taxation and immune to central control, undermining the fiscal foundation of the state. The court's attempts to expand its authority into distant provinces met with resistance from local elites and from the indigenous peoples of northern Honshu, later known as the Emishur, who resisted Yamato expansion until the 9th century. The population itself faced hardships. Epidemics, such as the smallpox outbreak of 735 to 737 CE, killed large portions of the population, destabilizing society and weakening the state. Crop failures and famines further strained the fragile system of taxation and labor obligations. In response, some rulers sought to consolidate power through more radical measures. The reign of Empress Kokin, later Empress Shotoku, r. 749 to 758, and again 764 to 770 CE, highlighted the dangers of Buddhist entanglement in politics. Deeply influenced by the monk Dokyo, she elevated him to unprecedented authority. Dokyo rose to the position of chancellor and sought to become emperor himself. His ambition alarmed the aristocracy, particularly the powerful Fujiwara clan, and after Empress Shotoku died in 770 CE, Dokyo was exiled. This episode underscored the growing tension between secular rule and religious influence. By the late 8th century, the court sought to restore balance and distance itself from the political turbulence of Nara. In 784 CE, Emperor Kammu moved the capital briefly to Nagaoka, and in 794 CE, he established a new capital at Heian, the city we now call Kyoto. This marked the end of the Nara period and the beginning of the Heian period, a new chapter in Japan's history that would see the flowering of court culture, literature, and aristocratic power. The Nara period, thus, stands as a formative era in Japan's past. It was the age when the Japanese state took shape in concrete institutions, a permanent capital, codified laws, a centralized bureaucracy, and a vision of imperial rule grounded in both native myth and imported ideology. It was an age of monumental cultural achievements, the Great Buddha, the Kojiki, Nihon Shoki, and Minyoshu that defined Japan's spiritual and literary heritage. And it was an age of contradictions, where ideals of unity clashed with realities of aristocratic dominance, religious overreach, and social strain. In the year 794 CE, Emperor Kanmu ordered the relocation of the Japanese capital from Nagaoka to a new site nestled in the fertile Yamashiro Basin. The new city was named Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. Today, it is known as Kyoto. This moment marked the beginning of the Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, a time remembered as the classical golden age of Japanese court culture. It was an era of refined aesthetics, elegant literature, and powerful aristocracy. Yet behind the splendor of palaces and poetry, it was also a period of shifting political power, growing provincial autonomy, and the slow emergence of the warrior class that would redefine Japan's future. At first, Emperor Kanmu, r. 781 to 806 CE, sought to strengthen the central state by reforming governance. He continued military campaigns against the emissure of northern Honshu, establishing garrisons and extending imperial authority into Tohoku. In 802 CE, the general Sakanu no Temiramuro was appointed as the first Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, a title that foreshadowed the later shogunate. Kanmu also attempted to curb the excessive influence of Buddhist temples in politics by moving the capital away from Nara's powerful religious centers. But as decades passed, real political power shifted from emperors to aristocratic clans, above all the Fujiwara family. By mastering the practice of marriage politics, the Fujiwara inserted their daughters into the imperial family. A Fujiwara regent, Seisho, or chief advisor, Kampuku, would then govern on behalf of a child emperor or even a ruling adult emperor. From the 9th through the 11th centuries, emperors often became figureheads, while the Fujiwara effectively ran the state. The high point of Fujiwara dominance came under Fujiwara no Michinaga, 966 to 1028 CE. Michinaga served as regent and Kampuku, wielding enormous influence over the throne. By marrying his daughters to emperors and ensuring his grandsons ascended the throne, he became the true master of Heian-kyo. A contemporary courtier wrote of him, "This world is indeed Michinaga's world. It is as if the sun and the moon dwell in his palms." The Heian court developed a culture of exquisite refinement. Aristocrats lived in sprawling mansions, where daily life revolved around poetry, music, calligraphy, and ceremonies. The pursuit of beauty and elegance, miyabi, was central to identity. Court nobles communicated through poetry as much as prose, and a single verse could convey affection, rivalry, or subtle criticism. Seasonal festivals, elaborate rituals, and romantic intrigues filled the court calendar. Out of this milieu emerged some of Japan's greatest literary masterpieces. In the early 11th century, Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at the court, composed the Genji Monogatari, the Tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel. Written around 1008 CE, it narrates the romantic and political adventures of Prince Genji with psychological depth and lyrical beauty. It offered a vivid portrayal of court life, with its fragile emotions, fleeting pleasures, and sense of impermanence. Another court lady, Sei Shanagon, authored the Makura no Sashi, the Pillow Book, a witty and insightful collection of observations, lists, and anecdotes. Together with the Genji Monogatari, it reveals the refinement and complexity of Heian court culture, dominated by the tastes and talents of aristocratic women. Although Emperor Kanmu had sought to check Buddhist influence, religion remained deeply intertwined with politics. Two major Buddhist sects arrived from China during the early Heian period, both shaping Japanese spirituality for centuries. In 805 CE, the monk Taisho returned from China and established the Tendai sect, headquartered at Enryakuji on Mount Hai near Kyoto. Tendai emphasized the universal potential for enlightenment and became closely tied to the imperial court. In 806 CE, another monk, Kukai, later known as Kobo Daisho, introduced Shingon Buddhism, a form of esoteric practice centered on rituals, mantras, and mandalas. Shingon established its headquarters on Mount Koya and soon became a major force in Heian religion. These sects enjoyed imperial patronage, and their temples grew into powerful institutions. Buddhist rituals were believed to protect the state, ward off disasters, and ensure prosperity. At the same time, indigenous Shinto practices continued, often blending with Buddhist cosmology. The Heian Age thus produced a syncretic religious landscape, where local kami were equated with Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in a doctrine known as Hanji Suijaku. The Heian court inherited the Ritsuryo system established in the Nara period, but over time it weakened. The land redistribution system collapsed, and aristocrats and temples accumulated tax-exempt private estates, shown. By the 10th century, the state's tax base eroded, leaving the central government dependent on provincial administrators and private power holders. The Fujiwara and other great families secured income from vast shown, while provincial governors, Kikushi, exploited local resources. Increasingly, the court's authority was symbolic, while real economic power rested in the hands of landed elites. By the late 11th century, some emperors attempted to reassert power, beginning with Emperor Shirakawa, r. 1073 to 1087 CE. Retired emperors governed from behind the scenes in what became known as the Insei, or cloistered rule. Shirakawa abdicated in 1087 CE but continued to exercise authority as a retired emperor until he died in 1129 CE. His successors followed the same pattern, establishing monasteries where they lived in retirement, while still directing politics. This system weakened Fujiwara dominance, but it also complicated governance. Now, power was split among reigning emperors, retired emperors, the Fujiwara regents, and increasingly, rising warrior families. While the Heian court pursued aesthetics, Japan's provinces became the breeding ground for a new class of warriors. Aristocrats who owned shown needed protection, and provincial officials relied on armed men to enforce order and collect taxes. These warriors, skilled in mounted archery and swordsmanship, came to be known as samurai. Two powerful clans, the Taira, Haika, and the Minamoto, Genji, traced their descent from imperial princes but built their power through military strength in the provinces. By the 12th century, these warrior clans were indispensable to the court, summoned to suppress rebellions and maintain security. One key event was the Hagen Rebellion of 1156 CE, a succession dispute that pitted rival factions of the court against one another. The Taira and Minamoto fought on opposing sides, marking the first time samurai were the decisive actors in imperial politics. 3 years later, the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 CE erupted, cementing the rivalry. The Taira, under Taira no Kayamori, emerged victorious, crushing the Minamoto and consolidating their influence. Taira no Kayamori, 1118 to 1181 CE, became the most powerful man in Japan. By marrying his daughter into the imperial family, he gained unprecedented control over the throne. In 1180 CE, his grandson, Entoku, was enthroned as emperor at the age of 2. Kayamori moved the capital briefly to Fukuhara, modern Kobe, and dominated court politics. But his power aroused resentment. The defeated Minamoto regrouped in the eastern provinces under Minamoto no Yoritomo. In 1180 CE, Prince Machihito issued a call to arms against the Taira, sparking the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185 CE. The war raged across Japan for 5 years. The Taira initially held the advantage, but were gradually worn down by the Minamoto forces. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Dan-no-Yura in the Shimonoseki Strait on April 25, 1185 CE. The Minamoto fleet, aided by defection within Taira ranks, decisively defeated their enemies. The child emperor Entoku drowned during the battle, and the Taira clan was annihilated. The victory of the Minamoto marked the end of the Heian era. In 1192 CE, Minamoto no Yoritomo was appointed Sei Taishogun, establishing Japan's first shogunate at Kamakura. Although the imperial court remained in Kyoto, its power was ceremonial. Real authority shifted to the warrior class, inaugurating the age of the samurai. The Heian period, lasting nearly 4 centuries, left a profound legacy. It produced enduring works of literature, refined aesthetics that shaped Japanese culture, and religious institutions that blended Buddhism and Shinto. But it also saw the decline of the Ritsuryo state, the rise of private estates, and the emergence of warriors as the decisive force in politics. Its end marked the close of Japan's classical age and the dawn of its medieval era. The victory of the Minamoto over the Taira in 1185 CE at the Battle of Dan-no-Yura had ended 4 centuries of aristocratic rule under the Heian court. The death of the young emperor Entoku and the destruction of the Taira clan marked a turning point in Japanese history. No longer would power rest solely in the polished halls of Kyoto. Instead, it shifted to a new warrior government in the east, centered on Kamakura, a coastal town in today's Kanagawa Prefecture. This transition gave birth to Japan's first shogunate, the Kamakura Bakufu, a system that would redefine the relationship between court, emperor, and military power for centuries to come. At the head of this new order stood Minamoto no Yoritomo, 1147 to 1199 CE. Born into the Minamoto clan, Yoritomo had survived the defeat of his family during the Heiji Rebellion in 1159 CE only because he was exiled rather than executed. For decades, he lived under surveillance, far from the centers of power. But when Prince Machihito called for resistance against the Taira in 1180 CE, Yoritomo emerged from obscurity, gathering warriors in the eastern provinces. By carefully building alliances with powerful local samurai families, particularly the Hojo clan, Yoritomo consolidated his power base. Following the Genpei War, Yoritomo moved to institutionalize his dominance. In 1185 CE, the imperial court authorized him to appoint shogo, military governors, and jido, estate stewards, across Japan, ostensibly to maintain order and oversee taxation. This gave Yoritomo's network of loyal warriors direct authority over provinces and estates, bypassing the traditional court bureaucracy. By 1192 CE, after the death of the cloistered Emperor Go-Shirakawa, Yoritomo was formally appointed Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo. The Kamakura shogunate was born. The Kamakura government, or Bakufu, tent government, represented a dual system of rule. On one side remained the imperial court in Kyoto, which continued its rituals, ceremonies, and symbolic authority. On the other hand, the military government in Kamakura, where the shogun and his deputies exercised real power. Yoritomo established a council of trusted samurai officials known as the Samurai Dokoro, which handled administration and discipline. Legal matters were addressed by the Manchujo, while the Mandakoro served as the central administrative office. Through these organs, Yoritomo created a government rooted not in aristocratic refinement, but in warrior practicality. The Shugo and Jito became the pillars of this system. Appointed by the shogun, they ensured loyalty, collected taxes, and mobilized troops when needed. This decentralization meant that power flowed directly from Kamakura to the provinces, eroding the old Ritsuryo order and empowering local warriors. Yoritomo's rule was brief. In 1199 CE, he died suddenly, perhaps from illness or a riding accident. His eldest son, Yori, succeeded him, but the boy proved incapable of leadership. Real power quickly shifted to the Hojo clan, into which Yoritomo had married. Hojo Tokumasa, Yoritomo's father-in-law, maneuvered to become the first Shikken regent for the shogun. Over time, the Hojo reduced the Minamoto shoguns to ceremonial heads, while they themselves ruled as regents. When the direct Minamoto line ended in 1219 CE, the Hojo appointed shoguns from other clans, including the Fujiwara, and even imperial princes, ensuring that the title remained a puppet under their control. This system created what historians call a regency shogunate, with the Hojo clan holding authority while preserving the fiction of shogunal legitimacy. The imperial court in Kyoto did not quietly accept this arrangement. Retired Emperor Go-Toba, R. 1183 to 1198 CE, attempted to restore imperial authority in what became the Jokyu War of 1221 CE. Go-Toba rallied loyalists and raised an army, but the Hojo regency responded swiftly. The Kamakura forces marched on Kyoto, crushing the imperial army. Go-Toba was exiled to the Oki Islands, and the Hojo redistributed lands from defeated courtiers to loyal samurai. This victory cemented the Bakufu's supremacy over the imperial court. From then on, emperors remained figureheads, their authority overshadowed by the regency in Kamakura. To stabilize governance, the regent Hojo Yasutoki promulgated the Gozaibai Shikamoku, formulary of adjudications, in 1232 CE. This law code provided guidelines for resolving disputes among warriors and managing estates. Rooted in warrior customs rather than Chinese models, it emphasized honesty, fairness, and the resolution of conflicts over land and inheritance, the lifeblood of samurai society. The Kamakura period also witnessed the emergence of samurai values. Warriors were bound by loyalty to their lords, rewarded with land or income in return for service. Military prowess, discipline, and honor became the cornerstones of identity. This was not yet the codified Bushido of later centuries, but its foundations were being laid. Though Kamakura lacked the courtly refinement of Heian Kyo, it fostered new cultural currents. Buddhism in particular flourished in fresh and accessible forms. Pure Land Buddhism, introduced earlier from China, grew in popularity. Preachers like Honen, 1133 to 1212 CE, and his disciple Shinran, 1173 to 1263 CE, emphasized salvation through faith in Amida Buddha and the recitation of the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu. Their teachings appealed to commoners and warriors alike, offering hope in an age of uncertainty. Another current was Zen Buddhism, brought from China by monks such as Eisai, 1141 to 1215 CE, and Dogen, 1200 to 1253 CE. Zen emphasized meditation, discipline, and direct experience of enlightenment. It resonated deeply with the warrior class, shaping aesthetics from architecture to garden design, calligraphy, and ink painting. Kamakura temples like Kinshoji and Engikuji became enduring centers of Zen practice. Even as Kyoto retained its aristocratic elegance, Kamakura cultivated a simpler, more austere style, mirroring the values of its warrior rulers. The greatest trial of the Kamakura shogunate came not from the imperial court, but from across the sea. In the late 13th century, Japan faced the unprecedented threat of invasion by the Mongol Empire. By the 1270s, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, sought to extend his dominion over Japan. He sent envoys demanding tribute in 1268 CE, but the Hojo regents rejected his overtures. In response, Kublai launched an invasion. In 1274 CE, a Mongol fleet of some 900 ships carrying 30,000 troops, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans landed in Kyushu. The samurai, accustomed to single combat, were shocked by the Mongols' use of coordinated formations, explosive projectiles, and overwhelming force. Yet after fierce fighting near Hakata Bay, a sudden storm forced the invaders to retreat, destroying many ships. A second invasion followed in 1281 CE, this time on an even larger scale. Two fleets, one from Korea and another from southern China, converged on Kyushu with perhaps 140,000 men. For weeks, Japanese defenders resisted behind hastily built coastal defenses. Then, in August, another powerful typhoon struck, devastating the Mongol armada. Survivors limped home, and Japan was spared. The Japanese saw these storms as divine intervention, calling them kamikaze, divine winds. The term would echo centuries later in another desperate defense of the homeland. While victorious, the invasions strained the shogunate. Maintaining defenses and mobilizing armies without conquering new lands for reward left many samurai disgruntled. The cost of defense deepened the regime's financial troubles and weakened loyalty to the Hojo regents. By the early 14th century, cracks were visible in the Kamakura system. The economic burden of military preparations, combined with limited opportunities for land distribution, eroded support among the warrior class. Disputes over succession and the arrogance of the Hojo regents further alienated allies. The final blow came with renewed conflict between the shogunate and the throne. In 1331 CE, Emperor Go-Daigo, R. 1318 to 1339 CE, launched the Genko War, seeking to overthrow the Hojo and restore imperial rule. Though initially captured and exiled, Go-Daigo escaped and rallied support. Two key samurai leaders, Ashikaga Takauji and Nitta Yashisada, turned against the Hojo. In 1333 CE, Nitta's forces attacked Kamakura, and after a desperate defense, the city fell. The last Hojo regent, Hojo Takatoki, committed suicide along with hundreds of his retainers. The Kamakura shogunate was extinguished after nearly 150 years of rule. The Kamakura era transformed Japan. It established the precedent of warrior rule, shifting power away from the court aristocracy. The dual system of Kyoto and Kamakura, emperor and shogun, would shape Japanese politics for centuries. Culturally, it nurtured new Buddhist traditions that brought religion closer to the common people. Zen aesthetics began to influence art, architecture, and philosophy, sowing seeds for future cultural flowering. The Mongol invasions tested Japan's resilience, fostering a sense of divine protection and national identity. Yet the Kamakura system also exposed the tensions inherent in warrior rule, the difficulty of rewarding samurai without constant conquest, the strains of maintaining military readiness, and the fragility of regental power. Its fall paved the way for the turbulent experiments of the Kinmu Restoration and the rise of the Ashikaga Shogunate in the following decades. From the misty beaches of Hakata Bay, where samurai first clashed with Mongol invaders, to the burning halls of Kamakura in 1333, the Kamakura period stands as a pivotal chapter in Japan's history, the dawn of the age of the samurai. The story of Japan in the late 15th and 16th centuries is one of upheaval, ambition, and unrelenting conflict. Historians call this era the Sengoku Jidai, literally the age of warring states, and it remains one of the most dramatic chapters in Japan's long history. Stretching roughly from 1467 to 1600, this period was marked by the collapse of central authority, the rise of powerful regional warlords, and a century and a half of near-constant civil war. It ended only when the archipelago was reunified under the emerging Tokugawa Shogunate, setting the foundations for 2.5 centuries of peace. The origins of this chaos lie in the Unnin War, 1467 to 1477. For centuries, Japan had been governed under the framework of the Ashikaga Shogunate, which had its capital in Kyoto. Though the Ashikaga were never as dominant as their Kamakura predecessors, the shogunate provided a degree of order. But by the mid-15th century, this authority was in decline. A dispute over the succession of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who reigned from 1449 to 1473, set rival factions against each other. The Hosokawa and Yamana clans, two of the most powerful samurai houses of the time, became the standard-bearers for opposing sides in this succession crisis. In 1467, Kyoto became the battleground as armies loyal to these factions poured into the city. What followed was a decade of urban destruction and bloodshed. Entire districts of Kyoto were reduced to ash. While the conflict was ostensibly about shogunate succession, it revealed a deeper truth. The Ashikaga shogunate no longer commanded real loyalty or fear. By the war's end in 1477, the capital lay in ruins. Yoshimasa had retired into the art-filled retreat of Ginkakuji, and the authority of the shogunate was shattered. This collapse of central power triggered the centrifugal forces that defined the Sengoku Jidai. Across Japan, provincial governors known as shogo and their deputies, the daimyo, asserted autonomy. Some were remnants of old aristocratic houses. Others were ambitious newcomers rising from the ranks of local samurai. Each began to rule their territories independently, waging wars of conquest against neighbors. The dream of one Japan gave way to a patchwork of fiefdoms, each seeking to expand at the expense of others. The warfare of the Sengoku era was different from earlier samurai battles. Gone were the days when small bands of mounted warriors exchanged formal archery duels. Instead, the period saw mass mobilizations of foot soldiers or a shigeru, often recruited from the peasantry. Armies numbered in the tens of thousands, sometimes even more. Warfare became protracted, brutal, and devastating to the countryside. Castles proliferated across the landscape, first built in wood and later in stone, as daimyo sought to protect their domains and project their authority. One of the most striking features of the Sengoku Jidai was the rise of new men leaders who came not from the old aristocratic houses, but from more modest origins, yet through ambition and ruthlessness carved out power. Among these were figures such as Hojo Son, who established the late Hojo clan in the Kanto region around Odawara in the early 16th century, and Takeda Shinjin, the famed Tiger of Kai, who ruled central Japan with disciplined armies. Religion also played a role in this fractured world. The Ikoiki, leagues of militant Buddhist monks and their peasant followers, rose in several provinces. They opposed samurai rule and sometimes controlled entire regions, as in Kaga province, where they governed autonomously from 1488 until 1580. These religious armies were disciplined and fervent, often defeating traditional samurai hosts. For decades, they stood as a major obstacle to the ambitions of emerging unifiers. In the midst of this strife, Japan encountered an external influence that would profoundly shape its course: the arrival of Europeans. In 1543, Portuguese traders landed on Tanegashima Island, bringing with them the matchlock firearm. The Japanese quickly recognized the potential of these weapons, and within a few years, local smiths were mass-producing Tanegashima guns. Warfare in Japan was transformed almost overnight. Samurai armies integrated musketeers into their formations, developing sophisticated tactics that stunned even European observers. Alongside firearms came new ideas and faiths. In 1549, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier arrived in Japan, introducing Christianity. The new religion spread rapidly, especially in Kyushu, where daimyo such as Omura Sumitada and Otomo Sorin converted, hoping to secure trade ties with the Portuguese. By the late 16th century, tens of thousands of Japanese had been baptized, and churches dotted the landscape. Christianity became both a spiritual and political force, adding another layer to the complex Sengoku tapestry. Amid this chaos, three remarkable leaders rose in succession, each pushing Japan closer to unification. The first was Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582. Born the heir of a minor warlord in Owari province, Nobunaga was unconventional, ruthless, and brilliant. In 1560, at the Battle of Okahazama, he won fame by defeating Imagawa Yoshimoto, a powerful daimyo commanding tens of thousands, with only a few thousand men in a surprise attack. This victory marked the beginning of Nobunaga's rise. Over the next 2 decades, Nobunaga pursued a relentless campaign of conquest. He modernized his armies, making full use of firearms and disciplined a Shigeru. His most famous demonstration came in 1575 at the Battle of Nagashino, where his musketeers devastated the cavalry charges of Takeda Katsuyori, son of Takeda Shingen, by firing in rotating volleys behind wooden palisades. It was one of the first decisive victories achieved through coordinated gunfire in world history. Nobunaga also sought to break the power of entrenched institutions. He crushed the Ikoiki, besieging their strongholds such as the massive Ishiyama Honganji Temple Fortress, which fell in 1580 after a decade-long war. He burned down the Enryakuji Monastery on Mount Hai in 1571, massacring thousands of monks to eliminate threats to his authority. Nobunaga was as much a destroyer as he was a builder, clearing the old order to make way for a new Japan. But in 1582, his career ended abruptly. While resting at the temple of Honnoji in Kyoto, Nobunaga was betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded by enemy troops, he committed seppuku. His dream of unifying Japan passed to his followers, but his role as the first great unifier of the Sengoku Jidai remains unchallenged. Into the vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 to 1598, a man of even humbler origins than Nobunaga. Born the son of a peasant foot soldier, Hideyoshi rose through sheer talent and cunning, becoming Nobunaga's trusted general. After avenging Nobunaga by defeating Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki in 1582, Hideyoshi methodically consolidated power. Hideyoshi's genius lay not only on the battlefield but in governance. By 1590, after the siege of Odawara against the Hojo clan, he had unified virtually all of Japan under his authority. He introduced nationwide surveys of land and population, reorganized taxation, and enforced strict social hierarchies. His famous sword hunt edict of 1588 disarmed peasants, ensuring that only the samurai class bore weapons, thus stabilizing his rule. Hideyoshi also lavishly patronized the arts, overseeing the development of the tea ceremony under Sun no Rikyu and commissioning magnificent castles such as Osaka Castle. Yet Hideyoshi's ambition extended beyond Japan. In 1592, he launched the first of the Imjin Wars, massive invasions of Korea intended as a springboard to conquer Ming China. Initially, Japanese armies achieved rapid success, seizing Seoul and Pyongyang, but fierce Korean resistance, aided by Chinese reinforcements, blunted the advance. Korean naval victories under Admiral Lee Sun-sin cut Japanese supply lines. After years of brutal stalemate, the second invasion in 1597 collapsed. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, his exhausted armies withdrew. These wars drained Japan's resources and left a legacy of devastation in Korea. Following Hideyoshi's death, a struggle for succession erupted. His infant son, Toyotomi Hideyori, was nominally his heir, but the real power vacuum invited rival factions. The strongest of these was led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1543 to 1616, a patient and calculating warlord who had long balanced loyalty and independence under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. The final act of the Sengoku Jidai came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where Ieyasu's forces decisively defeated rivals loyal to the Toyotomi cause. This victory allowed Ieyasu to consolidate power, and in 1603, he was appointed shogun by the emperor, founding the Tokugawa Shogunate. With that, more than a century of war gave way to peace and order under a new regime. The Sengoku Jidai left a profound mark on Japan. It was an age of destruction, but also of innovation, an era when social mobility was unusually fluid, when military tactics evolved rapidly, when new religions and foreign technologies arrived, and when the foundations of modern Japan were laid. It produced legends, castles, and stories that continue to shape Japanese identity. Above all, it demonstrated the resilience of a people who, out of civil war's ashes, forged one of the most enduring political systems in early modern history. The dawn of the 17th century marked a turning point in Japanese history. After a century and a half of near-constant warfare, the land was weary of chaos. Into this vacuum stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1543 to 1616, the victor of the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, October 21, 1600. His triumph ended the Sengoku Jidai, or Age of Warring States, and laid the foundation for one of the most stable and enduring governments in Japanese history, the Tokugawa Shogunate. Established in 1603 when Emperor Go-Yōzei formally appointed Ieyasu as shogun, the Tokugawa regime would last until 1868, a span of more than 260 years. It presided over profound transformations in society, politics, economy, and culture, while maintaining a strict order that kept Japan internally peaceful and largely closed to the outside world. Ieyasu understood that military victory alone could not guarantee stability. He sought to design a system that would prevent the chaos of civil war from returning. This system became known as the Bakuhan Teisei, or Shogun Domain System. At its core, Japan was a federation of more than 250 daimyo domains, Han, each ruled by a lord with a degree of autonomy. Yet all were bound under the supremacy of the Tokugawa Shogunate, headquartered in Edo, modern Tokyo. Ieyasu carefully balanced power by categorizing daimyo into three groups: the Shinpan, relatives of the Tokugawa house; the Fudai, hereditary allies; and the Tozama, former rivals. While the Tozama often controlled the largest and richest lands, they were deliberately kept at arm's length from central decision-making. To further ensure loyalty, the Tokugawa instituted the policy of Senkin-kotai, or alternate attendance. Formalized under Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu in 1635, this system required daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo and in their home domains. While in Edo, their families remained effectively as hostages, ensuring good behavior. The policy not only curtailed potential rebellions, but also fostered an extraordinary concentration of wealth and culture in Edo. which by the 18th century grew into one of the largest cities in the world with a population exceeding 1 million. The early Tokugawa period was also marked by the suppression of external influences, particularly Christianity. As noted earlier, European missionaries, especially Jesuits, had gained tens of thousands of converts in the 16th century. By 1614, Ieyasu issued an edict banning Christianity, fearing it as a threat to political unity and as a potential fifth column for European powers. Persecution was severe. Missionaries were expelled, converts forced to recant, and resistors executed. The most dramatic Christian uprising came in the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, where tens of thousands of impoverished peasants, many of them Christians, rose against heavy taxation under the local Matsukura clan in Kyushu. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by Tokugawa forces, with Portuguese ships aiding government bombardments, and an estimated 37,000 rebels and sympathizers were killed. In its aftermath, the shogunate's hostility toward Christianity hardened into outright exclusion. This process culminated in the policy later termed Sakoku, or closed country. Between 1633 and 1639, a series of edicts progressively restricted foreign trade and travel. The Japanese were forbidden to leave the archipelago on pain of death, and returning immigrants were executed. Only limited contact remained. The Dutch, confined to a small artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, the Chinese, who traded through Nagasaki, and the Koreans, who maintained an official diplomatic mission through the Tsushima domain. The Ryukyu Kingdom, under Satsuma control from 1609, served as another conduit to Southeast Asia. Officially, however, Japan presented itself as sealed off, cultivating the image of complete autonomy. In reality, it remained indirectly connected through carefully controlled trade and information. Despite this isolation, or perhaps because of it, the Tokugawa era was a period of remarkable internal growth. Agriculture expanded with new techniques and crops, leading to steady population increases through the 17th century. By around 1720, the population of Japan stabilized at roughly 30 million, one of the highest in the pre-modern world. Urbanization accelerated, with Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto forming the great urban centers. Osaka, in particular, became the kitchen of Japan, serving as the hub of rice distribution and financial markets. Culturally, the Tokugawa era saw a flowering of new artistic and literary forms that reflected the tastes of an increasingly urban and commercial society. The Jinroku period, 1688 to 1704, is especially remembered as a golden age of culture. Kabuki theater thrived, with dramatists like Chikamatsu Manzaemon, 1653 to 1725, crafting plays that explored love, honor, and tragedy. The ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, emerged as a popular art form with woodblock prints by artists such as Hoshikawa Muranobu, 1618 to 1694, and later Katsushika Hokusai, 1760 to 1849, and Utagawa Hiroshige, 1797 to 1858, depicting both the pleasure quarters and landscapes of Japan. The haiku form of poetry reached perfection under Matsuo Basho, 1644 to 1694, whose travel sketches like Oka no Hozamakai, Narrow Road to the Deep North, remain masterpieces of Japanese literature. At the same time, intellectual life developed in new directions. The policy of isolation did not entirely cut off foreign knowledge. Through Dutch traders at Dejima, Western books and ideas trickled into Japan, a current known as Rengaku, or Dutch learning. Japanese scholars studied Western medicine, astronomy, and later technology, producing pioneering works such as Kaitai Shinsho, New Book of Anatomy, 1774, a translation of a European anatomical text. Rengaku would later play a crucial role in Japan's modernization in the 19th century. The Tokugawa social order was famously rigid. It was structured into four main classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, in descending order of prestige. The samurai class, though only about 7% of the population, was the ruling elite, supported by stipends paid in rice. Peasants, who produced that rice, were legally bound to the land and heavily taxed. Artisans provided goods, while merchants, officially the lowest, gained immense economic power over time through commerce and finance. Beneath these four classes were the outcast groups, such as the ETA and Heian, who performed unclean professions like tanning or execution. In practice, however, economic realities eroded the neatness of this hierarchy. By the 18th century, many samurai lived in poverty while merchants grew wealthy, creating tensions that would simmer until the end of Tokugawa rule. The Tokugawa Shogunate faced several crises during its long reign. The Great Tenpo Famine, 1833 to 1837, devastated northern Japan, leading to widespread starvation and social unrest. The rigid system of alternate attendance and samurai stipends strained finances, plunging many domains into debt. Reform movements, such as those led by Mizuno Tadakuni in the Tenpo Reforms, 1841 to 1843, sought to restore order by imposing austerity and moral discipline, but these often provoked resentment and failed to address deeper economic imbalances. Externally, the greatest challenge came from the expanding powers of the West. Though Japan had limited contact with Dutch and Chinese traders, it remained largely ignorant of global geopolitics. By the early 19th century, however, Western ships began appearing more frequently off Japanese coasts. Russian envoys attempted to open trade in the early 1800s. British and American whalers sought safe harbors. The shogunate resisted, reasserting its closed country policy. In 1825, an edict ordered that foreign ships be repelled by force. Yet the balance of power was shifting. The shock came in July 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy sailed into Edo Bay with 4 black ships, steam-powered warships bristling with cannon. His arrival exposed Japan's vulnerability. Perry demanded the opening of ports to American trade and threatened bombardment if refused. After a year of tense negotiations, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, 1854, opening Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships and granting better treatment to shipwrecked sailors. Soon after, similar treaties were signed with Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands. These agreements, collectively known as the Ansei Treaties, 1858, granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners and fixed low import tariffs, deep humiliations that highlighted Japan's weakness. The opening of Japan destabilized the Tokugawa regime. Many samurai and intellectuals rallied under the slogan Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. They saw the shogunate's concessions as betrayal. Domains such as Chashu and Satsuma, long-standing Tozuma rivals of the Tokugawa, became hotbeds of opposition. Meanwhile, the imperial court in Kyoto, long politically marginal, emerged as a symbolic center of resistance. By the 1860s, the Tokugawa system was crumbling. The shogunate attempted reforms under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu, 1837 to 1913, but it was too late. In 1867, Yoshinobu resigned his office, formally returning power to the emperor in what is known as the Taisei Hoken. The following year, conflict erupted between Tokugawa loyalists and forces aligned with Satsuma and Chashu in the brief but decisive Boshin War, 1868 to 1869. The imperial forces triumphed, leading to the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which ended the Tokugawa shogunate and ushered in a new era of rapid modernization and global engagement. The Tokugawa era remains one of the most fascinating in Japanese history. It was a time of peace after centuries of war, when urban culture flourished, when a rigid but functioning order governed society, and when Japan shaped its own insular identity even as the world changed around it. For more than 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shoguns preserved a fragile but enduring stability. Yet in their determination to resist change, they left Japan vulnerable to the shock of Western imperialism, an encounter that would transform the nation in the century to come. In 1868, the collapse of the Tokugawa Shogunate gave birth to a new order in Japan. Known as the Meiji Restoration, it marked both a return and a revolution. The emperor, long a symbolic figure, was restored as the sovereign authority, yet the reforms carried out in his name transformed Japan into a modern nation-state. The period that followed, the Meiji Era, 1868 to 1912, was one of breathtaking change. In less than half a century, Japan went from a feudal society bound by centuries of tradition to an industrialized, centralized empire that could stand alongside the great powers of the world. The restoration began with the Boshin War, 1868 to 1869, a civil conflict between forces loyal to the shogunate and those rallying around the emperor. Key domains such as Satsuma, Chashu, and Tosa spearheaded the imperial cause, forming what was known as the Sacho Alliance. In January 1868, imperial forces captured Kyoto, declaring the restoration of imperial rule. Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu formally resigned, but his loyalists fought on. The decisive Battle of Toba, Fushimi, January 27 to 31, 1868, saw imperial troops armed with modern rifles and artillery defeat the shogunate army. Edo, the Tokugawa capital, surrendered peacefully in May 1868, avoiding large-scale destruction. Resistance lingered in the north, culminating in the fall of the Republic of Ezo at Hakodate in June 1869. With that, the old regime was gone, and the new Meiji state was secure. The young Emperor Mutsuhito, who reigned as Emperor Meiji from 1867 to 1912, became the symbolic heart of the transformation. Although real power lay in the hands of the Genro, elder statesmen, from Satsuma and Chashu, reforms were carried out under the imperial banner. In 1868, the government issued the Charter Oath, a brief but momentous document promising deliberative assemblies, social mobility, and the pursuit of knowledge from around the world. Its 5 articles encapsulated the spirit of the new era: modernization, unity, and openness to change. One of the first steps was the abolition of the old feudal domains. In 1871, the Heian reforms dismantled the Han system, replacing it with a uniform structure of prefectures directly under the central government. Daimyo were compensated with government bonds, and many were absorbed into the new nobility, or kazoku. The samurai class, long the backbone of Japan's social order, was gradually stripped of privileges. In 1873, the government introduced universal conscription, creating a modern national army. Samurai stipends were commuted into bonds, and by the 1870s, the right to wear swords was abolished for all but the military and police. These measures eroded the samurai's identity, leading to unrest and uprisings. The most famous of these came in 1877 with the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Seigo Takamori, once a hero of the Restoration. Disillusioned with the government's direction, Seigo and his followers rose in Kyushu. The Imperial Army, now trained in Western tactics and equipped with modern weaponry, defeated the rebels at the Battle of Shirayama, September 24, 1877, where Seigo was killed. The rebellion's defeat signaled the end of the samurai as a political force and confirmed the success of Japan's new military system. Industrialization was another cornerstone of the Meiji project. In 1872, Japan built its first railway, connecting Tokyo to Yokohama. Telegraph lines, postal systems, and modern banking followed. The government initially invested heavily in model factories and industries, from textiles to shipyards, before selling many to private entrepreneurs in the 1880s. This gave rise to the Great Zaibatsu, family-controlled conglomerates such as Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo, which would dominate Japan's economy for decades. Education was overhauled to support modernization. The Education Order of 1872 established a national system of schools, emphasizing literacy, practical knowledge, and loyalty to the state. Universities, including the Imperial University of Tokyo, trained a new generation of bureaucrats, scientists, and professionals. Study missions were sent abroad, most famously the Iwakura Mission, 1871 to 1873, in which leading officials toured the United States and Europe to learn from Western institutions. The mission returned convinced that Japan must adopt Western science and industry while preserving its cultural core. Politically, the Meiji leaders sought to balance reform with control. Pressure from activists known as the Freedom and People's Rights Movement pushed for constitutional government. After years of debate, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated in 1889, creating a constitutional monarchy modeled partly on Prussia. Sovereignty was vested in the emperor, who commanded the military and could dissolve parliament. Yet the Constitution also established an elected lower house, the House of Representatives, alongside an appointed upper house, the House of Peers. Though limited in franchise, only about 1% of the male population could vote initially. It marked a significant step toward representative government in Asia. Foreign policy was another arena where the Meiji state sought to assert itself. The unequal treaties signed in the 1850s had left Japan with little control over tariffs and extraterritoriality for foreigners. Revising these treaties became a national priority. Diplomacy, backed by Japan's growing military strength, gradually bore fruit, and by the 1890s, Japan regained tariff autonomy. More dramatically, Japan asserted itself through war. The first major test came with the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The conflict began over influence in Korea, a tributary state of Qing China. After a clash near Seoul in July 1894, Japan launched a full-scale invasion, deploying its modern army and navy. Victories at the Battle of Pyongyang, September 1894, and the naval battle of the Yalu River, September 17, 1894, showcased Japan's prowess. By early 1895, Japanese forces occupied Port Arthur and much of Manchuria. The war ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, April 17, 1895, in which China recognized Korean independence, ceded Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liaodong Peninsula, and paid a large indemnity. However, the triple intervention by Russia, France, and Germany forced Japan to return Liaodong, a humiliation that fueled resentment and steered Japan toward further military buildup. Japan's growing power set it on a collision course with Russia. Tensions over Korea and Manchuria culminated in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Japan struck first, launching a surprise attack on Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. Over the next year, Japanese forces scored remarkable victories. At the Battle of Mukden, February, March 1905, one of the largest land battles of the era, and at the Battle of Tsushima, May 27 to 28, 1905, where Admiral Togo Hayakaro's fleet annihilated the Russian Navy. The Treaty of Portsmouth, September 5, 1905, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, confirmed Japan's status as a great power. Russia recognized Japan's predominance in Korea, ceded Port Arthur and southern Sakhalin, and withdrew from southern Manchuria. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European great power, inspiring anti-colonial movements worldwide. Domestically, Japan tightened its grip on Korea. In 1905, Korea was made a protectorate, and in 1910, it was formally annexed as a colony. This expansion marked the beginning of Japan's imperial age, a trajectory that would shape its destiny in the 20th century. Taiwan, acquired in 1895, was also integrated as a colony, with infrastructure projects and industrial investments transforming its economy. The Meiji period was not only about politics and war, it was also a time of profound cultural change. Western clothing, architecture, and technology spread rapidly, yet Japan maintained a keen sense of its identity. The Imperial Rescript on Education, 1890, emphasized loyalty, filial piety, and reverence for the emperor, blending modern schooling with traditional values. The capital, Tokyo, developed into a modern metropolis, while Osaka and Yokohama became centers of industry and commerce. Newspapers, novels, and new forms of art flourished, reflecting a society in flux. By the time Emperor Meiji died on July 30th, 1912, Japan had transformed beyond recognition. In 1868, it had been a semi-feudal society on the periphery of world affairs. By 1912, it was a centralized constitutional monarchy, an industrialized power with colonies, a modern military, and a seat at the table of international diplomacy. The Meiji era was a revolution in every sense: political, economic, social, and cultural. It laid the foundations for Japan's 20th century trajectory, both its remarkable modernization and its eventual entanglement in imperialism and global conflict. The death of Emperor Meiji on July 30th, 1912, marked the end of an epoch in Japanese history. His reign had transformed the nation from a semi-feudal state into a modern industrial and military power. His successor, Emperor Taisho, Yoshihito, 1879 to 1926, ascended the throne in an era defined by shifting balances between democracy and militarism, liberalism and nationalism, peace and expansionism. The Taisho era, 1912 to 1926, is often described as a period of Taisho democracy, but beneath the surface of parliamentary growth lay deep currents of social unrest, economic challenges, and militarist ambitions that would shape Japan's trajectory into the 1930s. The Taisho emperor himself was a weak figure. Afflicted with illness and mental instability, he played little active role in governance. This absence of strong imperial authority allowed the Genro, elder statesmen who had dominated politics since the Meiji Restoration, to gradually lose influence, opening space for Japan's nascent party politics. From 1912 onwards, cabinets increasingly drew legitimacy not just from imperial decree, but from parliamentary majorities. The Rikkin Seiyukai, Friends of Constitutional Government Party, founded in 1900 by Ito Hirobomi, and the Rikkin Minseido, Constitutional Democratic Party, formed later in 1927, came to dominate the political landscape. The first years of the Taisho era were turbulent. The Taisho political crisis, 1912 to 1913, arose when the Seiyukai cabinet of Prime Minister Sanji Kinmochi resigned over budget disputes with the army, which had demanded increased military spending. When the Genro appointed Katsura Taro as prime minister without majority support, public protests erupted. Known as the Movement to Protect Constitutional Government, 1913, it mobilized urban middle classes, journalists, and intellectuals in mass demonstrations. Katsura resigned within weeks, and a Seiyukai cabinet returned to power. The crisis demonstrated that political legitimacy now rested not only on imperial sanction, but also on popular and parliamentary support, a key milestone in Japan's democratic development. Japan's entry into the First World War, 1914 to 1918, further reshaped its domestic and international standing. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Japan, allied with Britain under the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, declared war on Germany. Japanese forces swiftly seized German possessions in China's Shandong Peninsula, including the port of Qingdao, and occupied German islands in Micronesia, the Marshalls, and the Carolines. While Japan's military contribution was limited compared to the Western powers, the war provided expansion opportunities. In 1915, Japan issued the infamous 21 demands to China, seeking sweeping privileges in Manchuria and Shandong, as well as control over Chinese railways, mines, and even its government. International protests, especially from the United States and Britain, forced Japan to scale back its demands, but it retained influence in Shandong and southern Manchuria. This aggressive diplomacy deepened suspicion among Western powers and fueled Chinese nationalism. The war years also brought an economic boom. As European powers were preoccupied with the conflict, Japan became a key supplier of goods, textiles, ships, and industrial products to Asia and beyond. Industrial output soared, exports tripled between 1913 and 1919, and Zaibatsu conglomerates like Mitsui and Mitsubishi grew enormously. Urbanization accelerated, and a new working class expanded. Yet the boom was uneven. Inflation skyrocketed, rice prices doubled between 1914 and 1918, and rural farmers, who struggled to afford basic food, erupted in the rice riots of 1918. These riots, beginning in Toyama Prefecture in July 1918, spread nationwide, involving over 10 million participants. They reflected growing social discontent, the widening gap between rich industrialists and struggling workers, and the volatility of Japan's wartime economy. The Hara Takashi Cabinet, 1918 to 1921, marked another milestone in democratic politics. Hara, leader of the Saiyukai, became the first commoner and party politician to serve as prime minister. His cabinet promoted infrastructure development, expanded education, and sought to broaden suffrage. Yet Hara's assassination by a right-wing nationalist in Tokyo Station on November 4, 1921, revealed the fragility of Japan's political experiment. Internationally, Japan participated in the Washington Naval Conference, 1921 to 1922, which sought to prevent a naval arms race. The Five-Power Naval Treaty, 1922, established a 5-5-3 ratio in battleships for Britain, the United States, and Japan, respectively. While this recognized Japan as a major naval power, it also imposed limits that nationalists later denounced as humiliating. At the same conference, Japan agreed to return Shandong to China and withdraw troops from Siberia, where it had intervened during the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1922. These moves reflected international pressure but also signaled Japan's participation in global diplomacy. The 1920s brought both progress and tension. In 1925, the government passed the General Election Law, granting universal male suffrage to all men over 25, enfranchising about 12 million voters. This was a landmark in Japanese democracy, making the franchise among the broadest in Asia. Yet in the same year, the Peace Preservation Law, 1925, was enacted, allowing harsh penalties against those advocating the abolition of private property or the kokutai, the emperor-centered national polity. It was aimed primarily at socialists, communists, and labor activists, reflecting ruling elites' fear of radicalism amid global post-war unrest. Labor movements grew nonetheless. Strikes increased throughout the 1920s, and left-wing parties briefly gained traction. Intellectuals debated Marxism, democracy, and nationalism. Meanwhile, cultural life flourished. The Taisho period is remembered for its liberal, cosmopolitan spirit. Jazz clubs, cinema, modern literature, and avant-garde art spread in urban centers like Tokyo and Osaka. Women's movements emerged, with figures such as Hiratsuka Reicho and the Blue Stocking Society, Saitosha, advocating for gender equality. Yet these gains were fragile, often suppressed by state crackdowns. Japan also continued its imperial expansion. After the First World War, Japan received a League of Nations mandate over former German colonies in the Pacific, including the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands, extending its strategic reach. Korea, annexed in 1910, was subjected to harsh colonial rule. The March 1st movement of 1919, a mass protest for Korean independence inspired by Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric of self-determination, was brutally suppressed by Japanese forces, leaving thousands dead. Taiwan, under Japanese rule since 1895, saw both modernization efforts and cultural suppression. These colonial experiences deepened Japan's self-image as an empire, but also sowed resentment among subject peoples. The fragility of Taisho democracy was laid bare by economic crises. After the post-war boom, Japan entered a sharp recession in 1920, worsened by the collapse of the silk market and the Great Kanto earthquake of September 1, 1923, which devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people and leaving millions homeless. The disaster also unleashed violence against Koreans and leftists, as rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or planned uprisings. Thousands of Koreans and others were massacred in vigilante and police violence, highlighting the dark undercurrents of nationalism and xenophobia. The late 1920s brought further turmoil. The Shōwa financial crisis of 1927, triggered by bank failures, undermined confidence in party cabinets. The global Great Depression, 1929, hit Japan hard. Exports collapsed by 50%, rural poverty deepened, and many farmers were forced to sell daughters into prostitution to survive. Social unrest mounted, and faith in parliamentary politics eroded. Meanwhile, militarism gained ground. Many officers in the Army and Navy, frustrated by perceived diplomatic humiliations such as the naval treaty limits and angered by economic hardship, saw expansion in Asia as both a solution and a destiny. The army increasingly acted independently of civilian control, especially in its Guangdong army stationed in Manchuria. Radical junior officers espoused ultranationalist ideologies, calling for a return to the true imperial way, Kodoha, and direct rule by the emperor. The transition to the Shōwa era came with the death of Emperor Taisho on December 25, 1926. His son, Emperor Shōwa Hirohito, 1901 to 1989, ascended the throne. Although still young, Hirohito's reign would become the longest in Japanese history, encompassing the rise of militarism, the devastation of the Second World War, and post-war reconstruction. The early years of his reign, however, were overshadowed by growing instability. The breaking point came in 1931. On September 18, 1931, officers of the Guangdong Army staged the Mukden Incident, blowing up a section of the South Manchuria Railway and blaming Chinese forces. Using this as a pretext, the Japanese army launched a full invasion of Manchuria without authorization from Tokyo. Within months, they occupied the region and established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932, installing the former Qing Emperor Puyi as figurehead. The civilian government was powerless to stop them, marking the ascendancy of the military over politics. Thus, the Taisho and early Shōwa years represented a paradox. Japan had briefly flirted with democracy, achieving universal male suffrage and vibrant party politics. Cultural liberalism and international engagement blossomed in the 1920s. Yet economic crises, social tensions, colonial repression, and nationalist fervor steadily undermined this experiment. By 1931, The military's dominance and aggressive expansionism signaled the end of Taisho democracy and the dawn of a militarist era that would soon plunge Asia and the world into war. The Mukden Incident of September 18, 1931, marked a turning point in Japan's modern history, when officers of the Guandong Army, stationed in southern Manchuria, detonated explosives along the South Manchuria Railway and blamed Chinese forces. They created the pretext for a full-scale occupation of Manchuria. Acting without authorization from Tokyo, the Guandong Army rapidly seized key cities, and by early 1932, they had taken control of the entire region. The civilian government in Tokyo, led at the time by Prime Minister Wakatsuki Ryujuro, attempted to restrain the military but was powerless. The emperor, though officially the head of state, did not intervene decisively. In March 1932, the Guandong Army proclaimed the creation of Manchukuo, a puppet state headed by the last Qing Emperor, Huai, as its nominal ruler. Japan justified this as part of its mission to bring order and prosperity to Northeast Asia, but in reality, it was an act of outright aggression and colonial expansion. The international community reacted swiftly. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, sending the Lytton Commission to investigate. Its report, published in October 1932, refused to recognize Manchukuo as legitimate and declared Japan the aggressor. In response, Japan dramatically withdrew from the League of Nations in March 1933, symbolizing its growing estrangement from the Western-dominated international order. This diplomatic isolation deepened Japan's reliance on military solutions, emboldening those who believed that Japan's destiny lay in continental expansion rather than cooperation with global institutions. Meanwhile, political violence inside Japan intensified. Between 1932 and 1936, a wave of assassinations and coup attempts by radical junior officers shook the foundations of party politics. The May 15th incident, 1932, saw naval officers assassinate Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, effectively ending the era of party cabinets that had characterized Taisho democracy. Thereafter, military figures increasingly dominated the government. In 1936, the February 26th incident revealed just how far radical militarism had spread. Nearly 1,500 young officers and soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army staged a coup in Tokyo, assassinating government ministers and occupying parts of the city. Their goal was to purge the government of corrupt politicians and restore direct imperial rule. The coup failed, but its suppression left a chilling effect. The moderate faction within the army, the Toziha control faction, crushed the radical Kodaha Imperial Way faction, but both sides agreed that civilian party politics had no place in Japan's future. From this point onward, the Army and Navy exercised near veto power over cabinets. By law, both services had to appoint active duty ministers, meaning governments could not form without military approval. While Japan turned inward politically, it also turned aggressively outward. In 1933, Japanese troops advanced into Jihol province, beyond Manchuria, consolidating control over northern China. In 1936, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany, joined later by Fascist Italy in 1937. Though nominally aimed at opposing the spread of communism, the pact laid the groundwork for the later Axis powers. Tensions in China boiled over into full-scale war in July 1937. On the night of July 7, 1937, shots were fired near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. What began as a skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated rapidly into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces poured into northern China, capturing Beijing and Tianjin within weeks. By December 1937, they had taken Shanghai after months of brutal fighting, then advanced to the Chinese capital of Nanjing. The capture of Nanjing on December 13, 1937, unleashed one of the most infamous atrocities of the 20th century, the Nanjing Massacre. Over 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war, committing widespread rape, looting, and destruction. Though the Japanese government at the time denied the scale of the atrocities, they were well documented by foreign observers and remain a dark stain on Japan's history. Japan sought to crush Chinese resistance quickly, but the war dragged on. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek moved his capital inland to Chongqing, and Chinese forces, though poorly equipped, fought on with Soviet support. The conflict bogged Japan down in a war of attrition, consuming vast resources and manpower. By 1939, nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers were stationed in China, but victory remained elusive. The prolonged war strained Japan's economy and increased its dependence on foreign resources, particularly oil, rubber, and iron. This need for raw materials drove Japan to expand further into Southeast Asia. In 1938, the Japanese government declared the creation of the New Order in East Asia, envisioning Japan, China, and Manchukuo as a unified bloc under Tokyo's leadership. This vision evolved into the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a propaganda term for what was essentially Japanese imperial domination of Asia. Domestically, the late 1930s saw the tightening of political control. The National Mobilization Law of 1938 gave the government sweeping powers to direct industry, labor, and resources toward the war effort. Political parties were gradually dissolved or merged into state-controlled bodies, culminating in the creation of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association in 1940, which sought to unite all political and social organizations under a single, militarized framework. Japan also moved closer to the Axis powers. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally creating the Axis alliance. The pact stipulated that if any member was attacked by a country not already involved in the European War, the others would come to its aid, a clear warning aimed at the United States. That same year, Japan took advantage of France's defeat by Nazi Germany to move into French Indochina. In September 1940, Japanese forces occupied northern Vietnam, gaining access to bases from which they could threaten southern China. In July 1941, after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Japan extended its occupation to southern Indochina, giving it control over airfields and ports within striking distance of the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, rich in oil. The United States, alarmed by Japanese aggression, responded with escalating sanctions. In July 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and, together with Britain and the Netherlands, imposed an oil embargo. This was a devastating blow. Japan imported about 80% of its oil from the United States, and without it, its military would grind to a halt within 2 years. Faced with this crisis, Japan's leaders debated their course. Moderates sought negotiation with the United States, but hardliners insisted that Japan must secure its own resources through conquest. Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro attempted talks in 1941, but they collapsed as Japan refused to withdraw from China. By the autumn of 1941, the cabinet, now dominated by General Tojo Hideki, prepared for war. The final step toward conflict came in November 1941, when Japanese diplomats presented proposals to Washington that would have allowed Japan to retain its conquests in China. The United States, under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, rejected these demands, insisting on a full withdrawal from China and Indochina. With negotiations at an impasse, Japan's leaders resolved on war. On December 1, 1941, the Imperial Conference formally approved the decision to go to war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Even as diplomats continued discussions in Washington, the Japanese Navy prepared a daring preemptive strike. At dawn on December 7, 1941, December 8th in Japan, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a devastating raid, they sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. Although aircraft carriers were absent from the harbor that day, the attack crippled American naval power in the Pacific at least temporarily. Simultaneous strikes hit U.S. bases in the Philippines, British Malaya, and Hong Kong. This period of 1990 to 2010 is remembered not as a collapse, but as a sobering recalibration. Japan remained central to global culture, industry, and diplomacy, yet it faced profound questions about its identity and future. Would it reform and adapt to the realities of globalization and demographic change, or remain bound by hesitation and memory? The answer would define the decades that followed, leading into the crises and transformations of the 2010s. As the first decade of the 21st century ended, Japan faced profound questions about its identity, future, and place in the world. Its population was aging and shrinking, its economy stagnating, and its political system struggling to adapt. By 2010, China had surpassed Japan as the world's second-largest economy, symbolizing a dramatic shift in global power. Yet the 2010s would also test Japan in ways that reached beyond economics. Natural disasters, nuclear catastrophe, renewed leadership, and a shifting world order forced Japan to reimagine its resilience and reassert itself in uncertain times. On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced one of the most devastating events in its modern history. At 2:46 p.m. local time, a massive undersea earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku. Measuring 9.0 in magnitude, it was the strongest earthquake ever recorded in Japan and one of the most powerful in the world's history. The quake triggered a massive tsunami, with waves reaching over 40 meters in some places. Entire towns along the northeastern coast were obliterated, infrastructure destroyed, and lives swept away. The human cost was staggering. Nearly 20,000 people were confirmed dead or missing, and over 450,000 were displaced. Cities such as Sendai, Ishinomaki, and Rikuzen Takeda were reduced to rubble. Japan's advanced disaster preparedness systems, tsunami warnings, earthquake-resistant buildings saved lives, but the sheer scale of the disaster overwhelmed them. The crisis deepened when the tsunami disabled the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Flooding cut off cooling systems, leading to core meltdowns in 3 reactors and explosions that released radioactive material. The Fukushima nuclear disaster became the worst since Chernobyl in 1986. Hundreds of thousands were evacuated from a 20-kilometer exclusion zone, and fears of radiation spread across the nation and beyond. The disaster, referred to simply as 3.11, left lasting scars. It revealed vulnerabilities in Japan's energy policy, shook faith in nuclear safety, and raised broader questions about government transparency and crisis management. The Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, then in power, was heavily criticized for its handling of the crisis, further eroding public trust in the ruling class. the fallout from the 2011 disaster accelerated political change. The DPJ, which had ended the Liberal Democratic Party's long dominance in 2009, struggled with internal divisions and declining popularity. By 2012, voters turned back to the LDP, bringing Shinzo Abe, who had briefly served as prime minister in 2006 to 2007, back to power. His return marked the beginning of an unusually long and stable premiership in Japan's often turbulent political landscape. Abe introduced a bold economic program nicknamed Abenomics. Announced in 2013, it rested on three arrows: aggressive monetary easing, flexible fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms. The goal was to end deflation, revive growth, and restore confidence. The Bank of Japan under Governor Haruhiko Kuroda pursued unprecedented quantitative easing, flooding markets with liquidity. The yen weakened, boosting exports, while stock markets surged. Fiscal stimulus supported public works and recovery from 3.11. The results were mixed. Abenomics succeeded in lifting corporate profits, boosting the Nikkei index, and creating jobs. However, structural reforms lagged, wages stagnated, and long-term demographic challenges persisted. Critics argued that Abenomics was more about short-term optics than long-term transformation. Nonetheless, Abe's leadership restored a sense of stability and direction after years of revolving door prime ministers. Under Abe, Japan pursued a more assertive foreign policy. Recognizing China's rise as both an economic partner and strategic rival, Japan sought to strengthen its alliance with the United States while deepening ties with regional partners. The U.S.-Japan alliance remained the cornerstone of security. Abe maintained close ties with U.S. presidents, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. In 2016, Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Hiroshima, underscoring reconciliation and shared commitment to peace. Conversely, Abe became the first Japanese leader to visit Pearl Harbor with an American president, highlighting mutual remembrance and alliance. China's growing power loomed large. Disputes over the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu in Chinese, in the East China Sea intensified, especially after 2012, when the Japanese government nationalized several of the islands. Chinese ships and aircraft increased their presence in the area, leading to near-constant tensions. Abe responded by bolstering Japan's self-defense forces, SDF, increasing defense spending, and reinterpreting Japan's pacifist constitution to allow limited collective self-defense in 2015. Japan also promoted regional cooperation. It played a key role in reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, after the U.S. withdrawal in 2017, rebranded as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. Japan also sought to strengthen ties with India, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations, laying the groundwork for the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Throughout the 2010s, Japan's most intractable problem remained demographics. The population, which peaked around 128 million in 2010, was in steady decline. By 2020, it had fallen below 126 million. The share of those aged 65 and older rose to nearly 30% of the population, the highest proportion in the world. This demographic reality strained social systems. Pension and healthcare costs mounted, while rural depopulation hollowed out entire towns. Efforts to boost fertility, such as subsidized childcare, parental leave, and workplace reforms, had limited success. Immigration remained a politically sensitive issue, but by the late 2010s, Japan cautiously opened to more foreign workers, particularly in sectors facing acute labor shortages like construction and elder care. Culturally, the younger generation's outlook diverged from the salaryman model of the past. There was greater emphasis on work-life balance, though precarious employment persisted. Women's participation in the workforce increased under Abe's Womenomics initiative, but structural gender inequality endured. Japan remained a technological powerhouse, though its relative position shifted as China and South Korea surged ahead in certain industries. Robotics, high-speed rail, and precision manufacturing continued to showcase Japanese expertise. Companies like Toyota maintained leadership in automotive technology, particularly in hybrids and hydrogen fuel cells. Culturally, Japan's global influence flourished. Anime, manga, video games, and fashion remained global phenomena. The spread of Japanese cuisine, from sushi to ramen, also reinforced its soft power. Events like the planned Tokyo 2020 Olympics symbolized Japan's desire to present itself as a modern, vibrant, and resilient society. Yet challenges persisted. Once mighty giants like Sony and Panasonic struggled to keep pace with U.S. and Korean tech firms. The rise of smartphones eroded Japan's once dominant mobile phone industry. Still, Japanese pop culture and design continued to shape global imaginations. The 2010s reminded Japan of its vulnerability to natural disasters. In addition to the 2011 catastrophe, powerful typhoons and earthquakes struck repeatedly. The 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes killed dozens and damaged historic Kumamoto Castle. Typhoon Hagibis in 2019, one of the strongest storms to hit Japan in decades, caused widespread flooding and loss of life. Japan responded with improvements in disaster preparedness, early warning systems, and resilient infrastructure. The reconstruction of Tohoku became a national project, though recovery remained uneven. For many survivors, the scars of 3.11 endured long after the world's attention shifted. By 2020, Japan stood as a paradox. It was the world's third largest economy, technologically advanced, culturally influential, and politically stable under Abe's long rule. Yet it faced mounting internal pressures, demographic decline, social inequality, and an unresolved energy debate after Fukushima. Internationally, it balanced between cooperation and rivalry with China, deepened its U.S. alliance, and sought leadership in a multipolar Asia. The planned Tokyo 2020 Olympics were to be a showcase of recovery and national pride. But the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 upended those plans, foreshadowing new challenges ahead. The 2010s had been a decade of trials, resilience, and reassertion. From the tragedy of 3.11 to the ambitions of Abenomics, Japan demonstrated its ability to adapt to crises while grappling with long-term transformations. Its story in this period is one of persistence, a nation scarred but unbroken, navigating the turbulent waters of a shifting century. The dawn of the 2020s brought Japan into a new chapter defined by crisis, resilience, and transformation. A nation already grappling with demographic decline, an aging society, and economic stagnation faced the global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2020 and 2025, Japan navigated leadership transitions, shifting geopolitical landscapes, and pressing domestic challenges, all while continuing to balance its traditions with the demands of a changing world. This period of 1990 to 2010 is remembered not as a collapse, but as a sobering recalibration. Japan remained central to global culture, industry, and diplomacy, yet it faced profound questions about its identity and future. Would it reform and adapt to the realities of globalization and demographic change, or remain bound by hesitation and memory? The answer would define the decades that followed, leading into the crises and transformations of the 2010s. As the first decade of the 21st century ended, Japan faced profound questions about its identity, future, and place in the world. Its population was aging and shrinking, its economy stagnating, and its political system struggling to adapt. By 2010, China had surpassed Japan as the world's second-largest economy, symbolizing a dramatic shift in global power. Yet the 2010s would also test Japan in ways that reached beyond economics. Natural disasters, nuclear catastrophe, renewed leadership, and a shifting world order forced Japan to reimagine its resilience and reassert itself in uncertain times. On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced one of the most devastating events in its modern history. At 2:46 p.m. local time, a massive undersea earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku. Measuring 9.0 in magnitude, it was the strongest earthquake ever recorded in Japan and one of the most powerful in the world's history. The quake triggered a massive tsunami, with waves reaching over 40 meters in some places. Entire towns along the northeastern coast were obliterated, infrastructure destroyed, and lives swept away. The human cost was staggering. Nearly 20,000 people were confirmed dead or missing, and over 450,000 were displaced. Cities such as Sendai, Ishinomaki, and Rikuzen Takeda were reduced to rubble. Japan's advanced disaster preparedness systems, tsunami warnings, earthquake-resistant buildings saved lives, but the sheer scale of the disaster overwhelmed them. The crisis deepened when the tsunami disabled the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Flooding cut off cooling systems, leading to core meltdowns in 3 reactors and explosions that released radioactive material. The Fukushima nuclear disaster became the worst since Chernobyl in 1986. Hundreds of thousands were evacuated from a 20-kilometer exclusion zone, and fears of radiation spread across the nation and beyond. The disaster, referred to simply as 3.11, left lasting scars. It revealed vulnerabilities in Japan's energy policy, shook faith in nuclear safety, and raised broader questions about government transparency and crisis management. The Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, then in power, was heavily criticized for its handling of the crisis, further eroding public trust in the ruling class. The fallout from the 2011 disaster accelerated political change. The DPJ, which had ended the Liberal Democratic Party's long dominance in 2009, struggled with internal divisions and declining popularity. By 2012, voters turned back to the LDP, bringing Shinzo Abe, who had briefly served as prime minister in 2006 to 2007, back to power. His return marked the beginning of an unusually long and stable premiership in Japan's often turbulent political landscape. Abe introduced a bold economic program nicknamed Abenomics. Announced in 2013, it rested on 3 arrows: aggressive monetary easing, flexible fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms. The goal was to end deflation, revive growth, and restore confidence. The Bank of Japan under Governor Haruhiko Kuroda pursued unprecedented quantitative easing, flooding markets with liquidity. The yen weakened, boosting exports, while stock markets surged. Fiscal stimulus supported public works and recovery from 3.11. The results were mixed. Abenomics succeeded in lifting corporate profits, boosting the Nikkei index, and creating jobs. However, structural reforms lagged. Wages stagnated, and long-term demographic challenges persisted. Critics argued that Abenomics was more about short-term optics than long-term transformation. Nonetheless, Abe's leadership restored a sense of stability and direction after years of revolving-door prime ministers. Under Abe, Japan pursued a more assertive foreign policy. Recognizing China's rise as both an economic partner and strategic rival, Japan sought to strengthen its alliance with the United States while deepening ties with regional partners. The U.S.-Japan alliance remained the cornerstone of security. Abe maintained close ties with U.S. presidents, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. In 2016, Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Hiroshima, underscoring reconciliation and shared commitment to peace. Conversely, Abe became the first Japanese leader to visit Pearl Harbor with an American president, highlighting mutual remembrance and alliance. China's growing power loomed large. Disputes over the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu in Chinese, in the East China Sea intensified, especially after 2012, when the Japanese government nationalized several of the islands. Chinese ships and aircraft increased their presence in the area, leading to near-constant tensions. Abe responded by bolstering Japan's self-defense forces, SDF, increasing defense spending, and reinterpreting Japan's pacifist constitution to allow limited collective self-defense in 2015. Japan also promoted regional cooperation. It played a key role in reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, after the U.S. withdrawal in 2017, rebranded as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. Japan also sought to strengthen ties with India, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations, laying the groundwork for the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Throughout the 2010s, Japan's most intractable problem remained demographics. The population, which peaked around 128 million in 2010, was in steady decline. By 2020, it had fallen below 126 million. The share of those aged 65 and older rose to nearly 30% of the population, the highest proportion in the world. This demographic reality strained social systems. Pension and healthcare costs mounted, while rural depopulation hollowed out entire towns. Efforts to boost fertility, such as subsidized childcare, parental leave, and workplace reforms, had limited success. Immigration remained a politically sensitive issue, but by the late 2010s, Japan cautiously opened to more foreign workers, particularly in sectors facing acute labor shortages like construction and elder care. Culturally, the younger generation's outlook diverged from the salaryman model of the past. There was greater emphasis on work-life balance, though precarious employment persisted. Women's participation in the workforce increased under Abe's Womenomics initiative, but structural gender inequality endured. Japan remained a technological powerhouse, though its relative position shifted as China and South Korea surged ahead in certain industries. Robotics, high-speed rail, and precision manufacturing continued to showcase Japanese expertise. Companies like Toyota maintained leadership in automotive technology, particularly in hybrids and hydrogen fuel cells. Culturally, Japan's global influence flourished. Anime, manga, video games, and fashion remained global phenomena. The spread of Japanese cuisine, from sushi to ramen, also reinforced its soft power. Events like the planned Tokyo 2020 Olympics symbolized Japan's desire to present itself as a modern, vibrant, and resilient society. Yet challenges persisted. Once mighty giants like Sony and Panasonic struggled to keep pace with U.S. and Korean tech firms. The rise of smartphones eroded Japan's once dominant mobile phone industry. Still, Japanese pop culture and design continued to shape global imaginations. The 2010s reminded Japan of its vulnerability to natural disasters. In addition to the 2011 catastrophe, powerful typhoons and earthquakes struck repeatedly. The 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes killed dozens and damaged historic Kumamoto Castle. Typhoon Hagibis in 2019, one of the strongest storms to hit Japan in decades, caused widespread flooding and loss of life. Japan responded with improvements in disaster preparedness, early warning systems, and resilient infrastructure. The reconstruction of Tohoku became a national project, though recovery remained uneven. For many survivors, the scars of 3.11 endured long after the world's attention shifted. By 2020, Japan stood as a paradox. It was the world's third largest economy, technologically advanced, culturally influential, and politically stable under Abe's long rule. Yet it faced mounting internal pressures, demographic decline, social inequality, and an unresolved energy debate after Fukushima. Internationally, it balanced between cooperation and rivalry with China, deepened its U.S. alliance, and sought leadership in a multipolar Asia. The planned Tokyo 2020 Olympics were to be a showcase of recovery and national pride. But the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 upended those plans, foreshadowing new challenges ahead. The 2010s had been a decade of trials, resilience, and reassertion. From the tragedy of 3.11 to the ambitions of Abenomics, Japan demonstrated its ability to adapt to crises while grappling with long-term transformations. Its story in this period is one of persistence, a nation scarred but unbroken, navigating the turbulent waters of a shifting century. The dawn of the 2020s brought Japan into a new chapter defined by crisis, resilience, and transformation. A nation already grappling with demographic decline, an aging society, and economic stagnation faced the global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2020 and 2025, Japan navigated leadership transitions, shifting geopolitical landscapes, and pressing domestic challenges, all while continuing to balance its traditions with the demands of a changing world. Japan reported its first COVID-19 case in January 2020 when a man returning from Wuhan tested positive. The virus spread relatively slowly at first compared to Europe and the United States, but by spring 2020, clusters emerged, prompting the government to declare a state of emergency in April. Unlike many Western nations, Japan did not impose full lockdowns. Instead, it relied on requests for businesses to close, mask wearing, and voluntary compliance. This reflected both Japan's cultural norms of social responsibility and its legal limits on enforcing movement restrictions. Economically, the pandemic hit hard. Tourism collapsed, devastating regions that had benefited from a boom in Chinese and international visitors during the 2010s. Japan's GDP shrank by 4.3% in 2020, its worst contraction since World War II. The government responded with stimulus packages totaling hundreds of billions of dollars, including cash handouts to households and subsidies for struggling businesses. One of the most symbolic blows came when the 2020 Tokyo Summer Olympics, scheduled for July, had to be postponed for the first time in modern Olympic history. The Games were eventually held in July, August 2021 under strict pandemic protocols, without foreign spectators. Though intended as a celebration of Japan's resilience and recovery from the 2011 disasters, the Games were overshadowed by public opposition, rising infection rates, and muted international enthusiasm. Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister, resigned in August 2020 due to health issues related to ulcerative colitis. His departure marked the end of an era. Having governed from 2012 to 2020, Abe had redefined Japanese politics with Abenomics, defense reforms, and an assertive foreign policy. His resignation left Japan without a dominant political figure at a time of global uncertainty. Yoshihide Suga, Abe's chief cabinet secretary, succeeded him in September 2020. Suga, a self-made politician from rural Akita, promised continuity, focusing on digital reform and pandemic management. However, his approval ratings quickly declined as the government's vaccine rollout lagged in early 2021 and public frustration mounted. By September 2021, facing low popularity and an impending election, Suga announced he would not seek re-election as party leader. Fumio Kishida, a moderate from Hiroshima, became prime minister in October 2021 after winning the Liberal Democratic Party (LDP) leadership. Kishida emphasized a new capitalism that sought to address inequality, distribute wealth more broadly, and strengthen Japan's middle class. He also prioritized strengthening alliances in response to global instability, especially amid U.S.-China rivalry. Kishida's leadership was quickly tested. In July 2022, during a campaign speech in Nara, former Prime Minister Abe was assassinated by a gunman. The shocking event, the first assassination of a Japanese leader in the modern democratic era, shook the nation. Investigations revealed links between the gunman's motives and a controversial religious organization, the Unification Church, sparking public debate about political influence and transparency. Abe's death also symbolically ended the Heisei-era politics that had shaped Japan since the 1990s. Kishida guided Japan through the aftermath, balancing domestic reforms with an increasingly volatile international environment. He called for defense spending increases, pledging to raise it to 2% of GDP by 2027, an unprecedented move in post-war Japan. In 2022, his government published a new national security strategy, identifying China, North Korea, and Russia as major challenges. Between 2020 and 2025, Japan's external environment grew more complex. China's rise and assertiveness in the East and South China Seas continued to challenge Japanese security. Tensions over the Sengoku Islands remained constant, with near-daily encounters between Japanese Coast Guard vessels and Chinese ships. Meanwhile, North Korea conducted multiple missile tests, some flying over Japanese territory, underscoring persistent regional threats. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 reverberated globally. Japan condemned Moscow, aligned with Western sanctions, and froze Russian assets. This deepened Japan's ties with the United States and Europe, while also exposing vulnerabilities in energy security, as Japan depended on Russian liquefied natural gas. Kishida positioned Japan firmly within the coalition of democracies confronting authoritarian powers, enhancing its role in the G7 and beyond. The U.S.-Japan alliance remained strong. Under President Joe Biden, coordination deepened, with joint military exercises and expanded cooperation on cybersecurity, space, and semiconductor supply chains. Japan also strengthened ties with Australia and India through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, seeking to counterbalance China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. Domestically, Japan continued to struggle with its long-term demographic decline. By 2022, the population had fallen to around 125 million, with nearly 30% over the age of 65. Rural depopulation accelerated, leaving villages abandoned and straining local governments. Birth rates remained stubbornly low at around 1.3 children per woman, far below replacement level. Kishida promoted policies to support families, including childcare subsidies and expanded parental leave. In 2023, his government announced plans for unprecedented spending on measures to raise the birth rate. Yet critics doubted whether such policies could reverse deep-rooted social trends, including delayed marriage, economic insecurity among youth, and persistent gender inequality in the workplace. Economically, Japan faced rising energy costs, supply chain disruptions, and inflation driven by global shocks. The yen weakened sharply in 2022 to 2023, reaching levels not seen in decades, raising the cost of imports but boosting exports. Kishida's new capitalism sought to encourage wage growth and investment in green technologies, semiconductors, and digital infrastructure. While Japan remained the world's third-largest economy, it was increasingly overshadowed by China and challenged by South Korea in technology and cultural exports. Despite these challenges, Japan's cultural influence remained immense. Anime, manga, video games, and fashion continued to captivate global audiences. Series like Demon Slayer and Attack on Titan achieved worldwide popularity, while Japanese video game giants like Nintendo and Sony dominated the industry. Japanese cuisine maintained its global prominence, with sushi and ramen becoming staples far beyond Asia. In 2021, Japan hosted the rescheduled Tokyo Olympics under difficult conditions. Though subdued, the Games highlighted Japanese organizational resilience and showcased the nation's athletes. Naomi Osaka and Shohei Ohtani symbolized a new generation of globally recognized Japanese figures, bridging cultural and athletic spheres. Technologically, Japan invested heavily in robotics, artificial intelligence, and green energy. The government promoted hydrogen power and offshore wind projects, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. Though once criticized for falling behind in digital transformation, Japan began accelerating reforms to digitize government services and adapt to the global tech race. By 2025, Japan will stand at a crossroads. It is a nation of contradictions, wealthy yet aging, technologically advanced yet facing social challenges, peaceful yet increasingly militarized. Its democracy remains stable, but voter apathy and distrust of political elites linger. The legacy of disasters, both natural and man-made, continues to shape its psyche, from the 2011 tsunami to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet Japan has also shown resilience and adaptability. It has rebuilt after a catastrophe, maintained global cultural influence, and positioned itself as a key player in the Indo-Pacific. Kishida's leadership has sought to balance caution with assertiveness as Japan prepares for an uncertain future in which U.S.-China rivalry and global instability will shape its destiny. The story of Japan from 2020 to 2025 is one of survival and redefinition. Having endured pandemics, assassinations, demographic crises, and shifting global orders, Japan remains a nation that blends tradition with innovation, continuity with change. Its challenges are formidable, but so too is its resilience. As it moves forward, Japan's ability to adapt to demographic decline, redefine its security posture, and harness its cultural and technological strengths will determine its role in the unfolding 21st century.